In other news, Canada's ties to Venezuela could soon collapse. The federal government is bracing for the South American country to expel Canada's diplomats and cut off relations after it called Nicolas Maduro an illegitimate dictator yesterday, the day he was sworn in for a second term. Maduro was elected last year in a widely boycotted election that many foreign governments condemned. Since he became president in 2013, the economy in Venezuela has collapsed, and people there are facing hyperinflation and massive shortages of food and medicine. Canada is calling on Maduro to immediately cede power to the democratically elected National Assembly. Ben Rosewell is the president of the Canadian International Council. He served as the Canadian ambassador to Venezuela from 2014 to 2017. He joins me now from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Rosewell. Nice to see you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me on.
Can you describe for us, or how would you describe, I guess, the relations between Canada and Venezuela right now?
Well, they're certainly strained, but it's a complex relationship, and we have proved adept at discussing human rights with countries at the same time as discussing all the other issues that need to be brought to the surface, whether it's trade, consular issues. We do this in a number of countries around the world where there are human rights records that are just as difficult as Venezuela, and there's no reason why we should not be able to continue to do that.
Are those lines of communication open? And I ask because, of course, yesterday we saw Minister Freeland level some pretty pointed criticism. She called the government, she called the dictatorship illegitimate. And then earlier this week, President Maduro threatened to take diplomatic measures against Canada and other involved nations. He issued basically an ultimatum. Are those channels of communication open? I mean, you would know, you've been there, of course, during strained times as well.
I should say probably. I haven't been there for a year and a half, and I'm no longer representative of the government. But what I can say is that Canada is not alone in this. We are one of 13 countries that has declared President Maduro's presidency as illegitimate. Why is Canada being singled out? Well, I think it's because Canada is increasingly becoming the voice of the international community. As other countries are turning away from their longstanding support for human rights and democracy, I think primarily the United States, that voice of Canada is becoming more and more significant, and that's why I think you're seeing dictators like Maduro single Canada out.
Maduro was threatening to expel our diplomats, for example, and other actions. It was supposed to happen this afternoon, and it didn't. Did that, A, surprise you, and B, should it affect the manner in which we interpret his threats?
It doesn't surprise me because Venezuela will certainly know that any measure that they take against our diplomats will immediately be reciprocated. So they will lose their diplomats in Ottawa, and that would come at a very steep price to Venezuela. So cooler heads should prevail within that government if they are focused on the interest of Venezuela and Venezuelans. Now, that's a big if. This is a country that has repeatedly shot itself in the foot and shown that it's not committed to the interests of individual Venezuelans, and yet I think the potential punishment of losing the right to have Venezuelan diplomats in Canada should weigh heavily on them. I wouldn't rule out a number of diplomats being expelled. They certainly have done that several times in the past with a great many countries. I mean, this is sort of a favorite tactic of the Venezuelan government. But kicking all of the diplomats out of one particular embassy is really an extraordinary measure. I mean, that would be just such a massive overreaction, and it would really damage Venezuela more than it would damage Canada.
Can you describe for us, I mean, you did live there from 2014 to 2017. For a lot of our viewers who aren't familiar with the conditions there, I mean, we've had a number of guests describe how it's sort of the undercovered, crisis, one of the most undercovered crises going on in the world. Yeah. How bad are the conditions for people living there?
Well, think back to what we've heard about what life was like in Canada during the Great Depression, and then multiply that by 2. That's how bad the economic collapse has been. It means that every single family in Venezuela knows someone, a child, an elderly person who has died because they weren't able to get really basic medicine for really basic medical conditions. It means that almost everyone has lost a considerable amount of weight because they just can't put enough food on their plates. It means that almost every family has lost people to migration. We're talking about a country the size of Canada losing potentially as many as 5 million citizens in the year to come. It is a fact of everyday life. Everything, every aspect of your life when you live in Venezuela is affected by the virtual disappearance of the Venezuelan economy around them. And it's so you could understand why these people want to be able to choose who their government is. They want to have a say over the decisions that the government is taking that is causing this economic hardship, and they want to have a government in place that will actually turn things around. And that's what Nicolas Maduro has deprived them of with his decision to steal this election last year.
Do you think this very pronounced increase in pressure yesterday, as you mentioned, not just from Canada, will have any kind of effect? Do you see a change forthcoming anywhere in the near future?
It certainly has an effect. I mean, it means that the president himself will not be able to travel to a lot of countries. He won't be able to meet with other international leaders. There's certain types of international loans that a country can only get if there's a legitimate government in place. The Venezuelan government is already quite isolated on the international scene, and it's just getting more and more isolated. Now, President Maduro and his clique have decided seemingly that they will stay in power as long as they possibly can, no matter the cost to the Venezuelan people. But at a certain point, he's going to run out of rope. And so I think it's right for Canada to stand up for the popular sovereignty of Venezuela in the way that it's done. The sovereignty of Venezuela doesn't belong to President Maduro. It belongs to the citizens and the voters of Venezuela. And I believe, and I know this from the communications I've had with Venezuelans, they're very grateful for the position that Canada's taken.
Is there more Canada could do?
Well, I think what we're doing already is quite significant. We're really playing a leadership role in the region with the Lima Group. This is a crisis that is probably going to get worse before it gets better, unfortunately, and so there's going to be some need for an international response. At some point, there will be a government in Venezuela that will actually accept humanitarian aid, that will accept food and medicine to deal with the massive shortages. So we should be talking to others about how we participate in that. At some point, there'll be a government that wants to stop damaging the economy and start rebuilding it, and there'll be some requirement for a major reconstruction program of some kind, and so we should be talking to international institutions and partners about how we might eventually be able to respond to this support. Once there's a legitimate government in place in Venezuela, one that wants to fix the economy as opposed to just staying in power, there's going to be a lot of work for the international community, and Canada, I'm sure, is going to be a part of that effort.
Okay, thank you. Really appreciate your insight, Mr. Rosewell.
Thank you.